in this segment, we're going to be looking at editing workflow. And this is just simple, basic editing and workflow. And then later on in the course, we'll move through to the more advanced stuff. But here we're just going to concentrate on how to get started, a couple of things on how the basic tools work and how to optimize them in the best way as well. So when we look at an image, what do we first start with? Or what are the things that you should get nailed down before you get too excited and playing around with the more advanced tools? So I've got a selection of images here, and we're going to look at a variety of different types and see how we would start the editing process. Now, most of it revolves around these tools here. So white balance, levels, and exposure. Let's just get rid of layers because we're not going to look at that until later. And also to some extent, high dynamic range as well. Now, the exposure tool, I'm sure you're kind of aware with, or aware of, that's just making changes to exposure, contrast, brightness, and saturation. And we talk about some of the common questions which come up, like what's the difference between exposure and brightness? That always comes up. How does contrast differ to curves? And things like that. So we've got an image on screen, so how do we start? Now, my preferred thing to do generally, before anything else, is to try and get some kind of crop in place. And the reason for that is because the histogram is dynamic. So meaning that the histogram will represent what's inside the cropped area. So in this case, if we press C for crop to get our crop tool up, and then we throw on some kind of crop, let's just do this, then the levels will actually change. So if I make this sort of really small down here, so you can see how the levels are jumping around because it's based what's inside our crop. So it's kind of important to get a rough idea of how you're going to crop the image because that might have some influence on you setting your levels and so on. So let's just bring this back up to something sensible. I mean, of course, once you've set the crop, it doesn't mean that you can't change it or everything's going to be ruined, but it's, a good first step. So once we got our crop in place, we're thinking about, is the exposure good? Is the white balance good? How can I optimize the levels, for example? Now, if we look at the levels tool, and it's really important to get your head around how this works because it's often forgotten about and it's often not used in the correct way. So we can see here that we've got our histogram, which kind of sits roughly in the middle of the levels field like so, which is what we want. If we look at an image that is perhaps too dark, so let's take this one. So you can see how the histogram is kind of bunched more over to the left-hand side. So we're kind of looking for a nice histogram which sits somewhere in the middle. So like we can see on this image, for example, it's a bit too dark. So we'd want to lift up the exposure just to improve our histogram spread somewhat. Equally, if an image was too bright, then the histogram would be sitting all the way over onto the right-hand side. So let's go back to that first image and what would we do with the levels tool? So exposure-wise, I think it's pretty good. And the step which is often completely forgotten is actually setting your shadow and highlight points. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can do this manually. You can drag them in to the side, but the question is, at what point do I stop? And you can see as I drag them in, notice how the histogram readout is now nicely spreading across our whole range. Because what we're asking the levels tool to do is to take this value, 224, and remap it to this value at the top, 255. So imagine you're holding the ends of the histogram and you're stretching it out to those either ends. That's exactly what the levels tool is doing. So if I reset this again, you see the image looks quite flat, but just by bringing in those points and then fixing that, brings up a nice amount of contrast as well. But as I said a moment ago, at what point do you stop? And this is where we talk about clipping, or when we're actually removing data. Now, the way we visualize that is with the exposure warning triangle up here. So if I click this on, this will give me a colored indication of when we're starting to clip data. So that's when, if we look at the histogram, you see this spike is like falling off the end of the histogram because we've actually cut away that data. And if I hover my mouse over in the red area here, and these RGB values at the top, they're all reading 255, 255, 255, red, green, and blue, which means pure white. So we've actually got no detail there whatsoever. So what we don't want to do is sort of clip that data. Now, in Capture One, the default is that your shadow warnings are not shown. So you could be dragging this in thinking, why on earth can I not see any shadow clipping? Because by default, it's not enabled. So let's reset our levels tool once more, and let's go up to Preferences. And we see under Exposure, the first item is Exposure Warning. And we can see the color that is going to, the clipping warning color that will show, and also the shadow warning color. But you can see enable shadow warning is not ticked on. So let's tick that on. And we can also set some values at when you first start to see the clipping appear. So by default, it's 250 and 0. I think that's personally a bit too low because that's going to show the clipping really quickly, or at 250. So I tend to just bump this up a little bit to 252 or 253 so I can see when the clipping is going to start. So I know when to stop. And then shadow warning, just 2 or 3 points down here as well. So now I can see when my highlights clip, and now I can see when my shadows clip. So if we do a similar thing, if we bring this in, we can start to see it just sneaking in the top right-hand corner up there. And if we bring the shadows in, then if I just do it obviously a bit dramatically, you can start to see the shadows clipping as well. So as I said, manually you can bring these in, and that's always a good first step, and we'll look at a couple of examples. But to make that whole process easier, what you might as well do is click A for auto, and that will just simply snap those highlight and shadow points to either side of the histogram. And you can see it's just showing a little bit of clipping up here, but if, remember, I have my values set to 253, so that's showing it's just starting to clip at 253. And if we hold the mouse just over in this section, you see my red, green, blue values. I mean, the highest one, actually the blue is on 254, so it's on the limit. Now, if you're a bit worried that the auto levels might clip slightly, you can actually adopt the behavior of how the auto levels works. So if we go back to Preferences again, you see we've got some clipping threshold down here. So this is how much do you want to just bite into the histogram, if you like. So if you feel it's a little bit too harsh, we can make this value lower. So if I change it to 05 and 05, like so, and if we press A for auto again, click, see it just move them out a little bit. So that kind of gives me a bit of a safe zone, if you like. I mean, a little bit of clipping doesn't matter, but it's something you really do want to try and avoid, because something like this area up here, if that clips or blows out, especially when you compress it, you know, save it to JPEG, put it on Instagram, print it or whatever, it becomes more noticeable as well. So just by, in the Preferences, changing those values a little bit, that will give you plenty of free space on the outside of the histogram. So step 1, throw in a crop, roughly. Step 2, juggle between exposure and levels, and then press auto to set those levels. Now the middle one here in the levels itself allows you to, if you like, squish the whole histogram over to the left or the right, so that will have some effect on the midtones. So if we drag it this way, you see my midtones darken. If we drag it this way, the midtones, and to some extent the whole image brightens as well. But just by using these 3 sliders, you can get, you know, a pretty nice edit to the image. So the only thing we've done to this shot, for example, is the levels tool. So if I hold my Option key down and click on Reset, it's a lot better. It's taken that sort of flatness, milkiness away, and given us a much better start point. If we look at some other examples, still sticking with the levels tool, let's take this guy and we're going to reset that. And if we look at the RGB composite channels, and then we think about white balance, we can see the red, green and blue, they're kind of separated. So that gives me a good idea that the white balance probably isn't perfect on this image. Also, if I look at his shirt, I can see the values. If we look at the red, green, blue values, they're not equal. And I'm assuming his shirt is white, pretty sure it probably is. So our red, green, blue value should be pretty close as well. So a couple of ways to set white balance. We can grab the picker, this one here in the white balance tool itself, and click on a part which we assume to be grey. So that's one method of doing it. We can also pick out various different presets as well, like so. That's looking a bit cold to me. Or we can just manually use our eyes and dial it in to be something that looks pleasing. And finally, like the levels tool, we can also say A for auto as well. There's of course the mathematically correct perfect white balance, and there's also the one that you like the look of as well. So I wouldn't get too caught up in trying to get the perfect mathematical white balance. You know, photography is all about some emotion and feeling as well. So we're in Cuba, it probably doesn't look good if it's too cold. It looks better if it's a little bit warmer, for example. But again, with this one, I would start with, let's reset. I would start with a crop, because if there was some huge, sun reflection bouncing off the wall, that's going to give me a bad indication. H on my keyboard, because then that will show me the cropped image. And then right away, we could see that the levels are not quite right and the white balance is not quite right. So I know his shirt's white, so I'm going to balance off that and then just maybe warm up a smidge as well. So that gives me a good start point, and I can see that we don't have to make any changes to the highlights, because if I start moving that in, if we turn this in, we're going to start losing the data in his shirt straight away. So you'll probably find when we hit auto levels that highlight marker is not going to move, but the shadows will pop in a little bit, as you can see down here. And finally, if you grab the midtones, we can just darken that down. So once again, we've only done 2 edits with this, slight white balance tweak and levels, and we can already see the difference is going in the right direction. Now, I said in the first image that, what did I say in the first image? The first image, I said that we're looking to, improve the histogram somewhat. Sometimes it's perfect, of course, like if we take this shot, it's absolutely, let's just reset, make sure it's out of the box. You see it's absolutely spot on exposure-wise. So we've got tones all the way from shadows through to highlights. So if we say auto on our levels, it makes a little tiny indent. And on this case, I just might want to make sure if I check my exposure warning that we're not blowing anything out, and that's fine. Because again, I set my values at a few points for shadows and a little bit less for highlights. Now, if we look at something that is kind of shot darker, so we've got this image, and if we look at the histogram, technically we might think, okay, it's too dark, I need to heap in a whole bunch of exposure. But first of all, let's grab the crop, and we want to get rid of this guy in the high-vis jacket. Press H again on my keyboard, and then we can look at the levels. So technically, if I wanted to bring this exposure up to the correct amount, we probably end up going quite sort of high to something like that. But it sort of ruins the emotion a little bit as well, because now it looks like it was shot much earlier on the day. I don't know if the metadata is correct, but I'm willing to guess this was shot in the evening. So yeah, 5:30. This was taken. So that's also not very sympathetic to the image itself. So let's reset the exposure and think about this in a different way. What I would prefer to do on this is just raise up the shadows a little tiny bit. So just the shadows a bit. And this is where we bring in the high dynamic range tool. So high dynamic range just literally targets on the shadows and the highlights. It's maybe not the best name for the tool, but what we're thinking about is isolating either the right-hand side of the histogram or the left-hand side of the histogram. So in this case, if I bump up the shadows, then if you look at the histogram here, we can see that peak is just moving its way towards the center. So it's lifting the shadows, but this area here really isn't changing at all. And equally, if I bring the highlights down, you'll see these little bumps will just start creeping their way to the middle, like so. So you can see that's a really tight isolation of the highlights, which is just affecting these clouds up in the top right-hand corner. So as well as having, if you like, the technically correct adjustment, it should also be sympathetic to the image itself. So how I would approach this one is maybe a tiny bit of exposure, lifting the shadows a little bit, and then hitting A for auto on my levels like so, and that just snaps it in nicely. And a quick check of the exposure warning as well. Exposure warning, that's under the view menu. So if you wanted to shortcut key that could be a smart thing to do as well, just to save you having to mouse up to this point. And I'm willing to bet it's just about blown out, so probably just a little tiny bit of the highlight slider, we could actually bring that back in quite nicely. So we've perfectly optimized pretty much everything in that image. So it still looks sympathetic to when it was taken, 5:30 in the evening. But we've upped the contrast a bit. We've got a bit more detail in the shadows, so we can see what's going on in here, which is really important. And it looks great. And once again, if we do Option click on the reset button, we can see before and after. So just a few changes, but big benefit to the image. If we stop right there, we'd actually get, a pretty nice result just from using the levels tool, exposure, and high dynamic range, and that's it. Sometimes images look generally flat, so if we take a little trip to Sicily, let's reset that, Command R. See, it just looks a little bit flat and slightly lifeless, and that's again because we have no information at this end of the histogram. So exposure-wise, it's probably fine. So if we say A for auto, instantly, it brightens up and comes to life because we now have a good spread from shadows all the way to highlights. Now, one thing that we can do also with the levels tool, especially with the auto operation, is to try to remove some haze, if you like. And there's a good example here. So let's bring this image up. So you can see it's very, very hazy. So almost like a blue mist, if you like. If we zoom in over back here and we just stick the cursor here to some point, you can see the blue levels much, much higher. So we've got this blue haze going on. So there is a different operation of the levels tool which can help to counteract that as well. So once again, before we do any of that, let's just get some kind of crop in place. I want to straighten it, so let's use this cursor tool. So we haven't looked at this one yet, it's the straighten tool. Let's just reset, so straighten tool. So it means I can draw along a horizon, which I'm guessing is something like that, and then the image will just rotate about that point. C for crop, so I'm going to crop it something like this. So this is the image that we, are at this point we want to work with. And as you can see, it's really, really flat with this kind of blue cast in the highlights as well. I could try to correct that with white balance to some extent, but now the white balance is sort of off a little bit and it still doesn't look necessarily as good as it could. So if we go back to the preferences, and you'll see under the levels tool, there's a channel mode, RGB channel, or red, green, and blue channels. And this describes how the auto mode works. So it only affects when you hit auto. By default, it's RGB channel. And that means Capture One will do exactly what we've been doing. It will just pop those shadows and highlights into either end of the levels tool. If we switch it to this mode, red, green, and blue channels, it will do a different levels adjustment for each color channel. So in this case where we see we've got this strong presence of blue in the highlights, it'll help to correct for that. Let's do a test. So I'm just going to change this back to the normal one, and I'm going to clone a variant. So under the image menu, you'll find this option called clone variant. This makes virtual copies of the image. So you can make new variants or clone. New variant will make you a virtual copy with no adjustments. Clone variant will make you a copy with the adjustments that are currently applied to the image. So this is great for making like a color in a black and white, for example, or if you're not sure which direction you want the edit to go in, you can at some point clone the variant and then you can go off on one tangent and then off on a different tangent. For this case, I can show you how the two different level modes work. So we're going to clone this, and then on number 2, you can see the variant names here, 2 and 3, or variant numbers. On the first one, if we go back into preferences, we're going to do it in the default mode. So let's say A for auto, and there's my adjustment. You can still see it's really kind of bluish in the highlights in the skyline at the back. If we go to the next one, and we're going to change in preferences the channel mode to red, green and blue, and we say auto, and then we get a levels adjustment, and if we put the two side by side, let's hide my browser, let's hide the tools, let's turn off the proofing so we've got a bit more space. So the one on the left was done with the standard operation, and you see the one on the right was done with the individual channels. And you can see if we look kind of around here, this looks much better with its color toning. We've lost that sort of presence of that heavy blue, if you like, sitting around here. Now we've still got a little bit up in the top, which is normal. We can correct that in other ways, but overall the image looks much better. So if we look at the levels tool itself, so this is the first one, and we look at red, green and blue. So there's only adjustment on the composite, like so. If we look at this one, and we look at red, green and blue, so if we look at the values down here, so red has a value of 32 and 232, green has 33 and 233, and blue has 40 and 234. So the levels were done for each individual color channel. And just by flicking back and forth, we can see quite a dramatic difference. So if you have an image which has perhaps this phenomenon of haze, or it's just there's a color cast that's sneaking in somewhere, often that change in the levels tool can help that go a long way. Now, would you leave it on permanently? Probably not. I don't think it would do much harm, but it's something that you can pick up as a choice as well. So the little levels tool, which often gets ignored, is really powerful. It can make a big difference to your image. Like one final example, let's take this one, reset that. Super flat and muddy. All we need to do is bring up the exposure a bit. White balance is probably okay. I personally would just warm it up a touch because it's a nice sunny day, just manually by pulling the Kelvin slider. And then A, auto, job done, almost. Just those few simple corrections go a long way from this to this. So what people can often get stuck in is ignoring the levels tool and then just trying to use other different tools to pull it up to, an end result when the levels tool would have done all of that for you.